to welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. My name is Mark Gatos. I am the CMO here at Nlyte. I want to again thank everyone for the time you're going to be spending with us. We're going to start right here at the top of the hour. I try to keep a pretty fast-moving webinar anytime I do them. I think most of us have experiences with webinars that are pretty slow and tedious, and so I try and keep the pace pretty quick. So we'll be going through quite a few slides. So the title of today's webinar is How to Make Money with Nlyte. And the impetus for this particular webinar was I was presenting to our sales folks down in Orlando. We had a sales kickoff at the beginning of the year and gave a presentation sort of about the problem, really talking about the problem that Nlyte solves. And Justine said, hey, would you be willing to do this for our partners? And I see a lot of our partners out there, and there are more that are continuing to join. They all seem to have the first name that starts with the letter A. I'm not quite sure if that's just Justine beginning at the alphabet and moving down through it. But I want to really, the impetus for this, as I said, was really I'd done this presentation. Justine said this was great. And so it's pretty much a lot of that presentation. I've added a few additional slides. But it really is about how do you make money with Nlyte. And really, I'll talk about a lot of that has to do with what is the problem we're solving, right? So fundamentally, we are all here to make money, right? We certainly want to enjoy our lives. We want to have a great happiness factor in our life. But I'm assuming everybody wants to make money, and that's really what I want to talk about here. And how to make money with Nlyte is to get customers to recognize the problem they have and to implement Nlyte, right? So that's sort of my fundamental principle. To make money, you've got to get people to see the problem they have and to see that Nlyte is going to solve that problem and provide a great value to them. And so today's agenda, I'm going to start a little bit talking about the DSIM market, right? What's happening with it? Is it growing? Is it contracting? What's happening? I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk about a little bit about Nlyte sales basics, right? And then I'll talk about there's really two types of sales that you have to quickly identify if you're going in to talk to a prospect, any type of company or government organization. I'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about finding the problems. What is that real problem that Nlyte solves? So without further ado, let's sort of just continue. By the way, this webinar is being recorded, so if you have any questions, please feel free to just type them in, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So an article came out just recently from Search Data Center, and we were talking to Meredith, but we were actually talking to her about DSIM, but even independently from that, she had published a report. You can go look for it out there, an article called 6 Data Center Trends to Expect in 2015, and I've listed all 6. But if you look at that 6th bullet point, she sees as a trend facility and IT accountability. And we're hearing this again and again in the market, that a lot of money has been poured into data centers. And if you think about it, over the last few years, there's just been a mad rush to, we need to have a mobile app, we need to have a social app, we need to have big data or Internet of Things. There's been this rush to put these applications out there, but without any real accountability. It was sort of like the data center had carte blanche, and I think a lot of companies are reeling that in. You know, we just heard a story of a company that's buying Nlyte because basically the CFO got a new PO that wanted 1,000 servers, and he said, stop. I want to know where these servers, the servers I bought before these went, because I've been signing these POs and I have no idea what they're being used for. Are they being used? Where are they even located? They could be leaving the building for all he knew. So he said, I'm not going to sign another PO till somebody can tell me exactly where this equipment is going. And so I think facility and IT accountability is starting to be an issue because there's been this massive investment, and now people want to see what's happening with that investment and make sure they're getting the maximum use of those particular assets. And then this just came out literally days ago, a technology overview for data center infrastructure management tools. This is a report that came out of Gartner, literally, as I said, a few days ago. And the key findings really are talk about the fact that companies have to really be looking at DSIM, that for any size data center, I'm not going to go through and read each of these key findings, but the summary is we've reached a point of maturity where data centers have to do something. If they have any sort of size, if they're 50, 100 racks or more, they really have to provide some type of solution to really be optimizing the use of their data center. And then here was a report that came out from Gartner in 2014, which basically says if you take a look at how many racks, using Gartner's sort of estimates, and they tend to usually be pretty conservative, if you take the data centers that could fundamentally use DSIM, which are those data centers that are 1,000 or above, 1,000 square feet or above, only 7% of those racks have really been accounted for. And if you think about it, a lot of the hyperscale, large organizations are using DSIM today. There's a huge amount of the market, according to Gartner, 93% of the market still hasn't really deployed some type of DSIM solution. So there is still huge opportunity in this market, but really at the core of this, it's getting people to recognize that they're wasting money, that they're not as efficient as they could be, they're not as agile as they could be. And we'll get to that in a few slides. We'll be talking about the particular problem. But as this really indicates, the market is still there. I mean, a majority of the market, 93% of the market is still available. So there's still plenty of opportunity to make money with DSIM and get people to sort of recognize the issue. So this is a particular book that I find sort of interesting. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's called Pitch Anything. And what this particular Oren found, and he had done some research on this, is that basically a majority of the time, 9 out of 10 times, when people get to the point where you have that moment of truth, where you have somebody's attention, they're a decision maker, often we don't nail the pitch. We don't nail the core issue that the person has and really create a compelling case for whatever we're trying to sell. So in this case, Nlyte, and as I was talking to our direct sales force at Nlyte, really it is solving problems. And I'm going to get into that in just a second, and we'll get into sort of the sales basics. But really a lot of this presentation is about when you have that moment of truth, you have the attention of the person who is a decision maker, what are you going to say? What is that thing you're going to say that's compelling that he goes, yes, I need to talk to you. Yes, I need to deploy Nlyte. So forgive me, for many of you, this is what I call sales basics. You've probably all heard this before, but I always go back to the fundamentals and fundamental basics of sales, right? I was taught this very early in my career, and I'm kind of an old guy. So in many ways, I've been sort of going to this again and again, and it's very true. There are 3 questions you have to be able to answer as a person selling technology, right? I think it applies to other industries, but I think for technology especially, you really have to understand these 3 questions. Why this, why us, and why now, okay? And you can have problems with any of the above, right? Why this is really, what is the problem that data center infrastructure management solves, right? Forget Nlyte, forget any of the other companies that are in this market. Why do you want a DSIM solution, like just to start with, right? Because you can go and pitch why Nlyte's different and all the differentiation, but in the end, if the customer hasn't bought into the problem you solve, what's the point, right? So really, you've got to explain the segment that you're in, right? Anytime you're selling technology is, what is this thing and why do I care? What is the problem being solved? What is the value? Then you get into differentiation, and believe me, tech companies love to just jump right here. Let us tell you how we're different. Let us tell you how we're differentiated. Oh, our great features and functions, and oh, and our scalability and all of this. And that's great. But if you don't have the problem solved first, right, you're trying to differentiate, and they haven't necessarily bought into that they have that problem. And we'll get into this a little bit more. And then last, which is often very challenging, this is the sense of urgency. Why now? Why should I spend time? Why should I write a check? Why should I go to the trouble to deploy this technology, go through that effort, write a check versus doing something else or just delaying? And I call that the sense of urgency, right? Why now? And so we'll talk about all these things. In a lot of ways, the presentation is going to very much focus on the problem solved. But I like to sort of frame it in these sort of three sales basics, right? Why this, why us, and why now? So let's get into DSIM, right? Forget about Nlyte for a second. Let's just talk about data center infrastructure management, right? What is the challenge that a lot of companies have, right? The challenge is the complexity in a data center of managing all the people, the resources, networking, assets. There are policies, there are processes they follow. There are the business requirements from the business users, make it basically impossible, if not extremely difficult, to efficiently operate using manual methods, right? Any data center with any certain amount of complexity or processes and policies is just going to be too difficult to manage with spreadsheets, too difficult to manage using Visio drawings. A great example, I was talking to a bank in Australia, and they basically had done they had outsourced their IT to IBM, and IBM had come in and done an audit of what they thought their assets were and where those assets were located. And a majority of the data was inaccurate, meaning either those assets did not exist or they did not exist where they were supposed to be located. So you can imagine at that point, the CFO goes crazy, everyone's running around because basically their information, their source of truth is completely inaccurate. It's a majority inaccurate, right? So where are these assets? People could literally be walking out the door with them and they wouldn't be certain. So this is the real challenge, right? Is if you go to an exec and say, the data center is complex, there's a lot of things going on, you've spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars or euros or pounds, right, on this asset that's consuming power, has many assets in it, and yet you're managing it with spreadsheets and Visio drawings. It just doesn't make sense. And so as a result, the result of this challenge is there's a very simple problem. If you are managing a data center in manual ways, your costs are going to be higher for your resources. That's not just only energy. It could be assets. It could be service agreements, but basically your costs are going to be higher. Your people are going to take more time to do everything. There's going to be more effort required for people to do their jobs. By the way, this is also increased costs because people are not as efficient as they could be. They literally could be spending hours trying to find assets or figure out where they're going to put in new assets or figure out if there's enough power or enough networking to support new assets being put on the floor, right? Or they're trying to keep up with the tech refresh process and don't know which assets have to be refreshed. But basically, your personnel are required to take more time to do every single function. And so as a result of this problem, right, you have the increased costs, people are taking more time to do their jobs, right? It requires more effort. And lastly, sort of related to the second one, you just have decreased agility in responding to the needs of the business. These are sort of the three core problems, right? And so you think if you back up and you get to an executive and you say, your data center has all these things going on in it, right? You've got people, you've got policies, procedures, assets coming in, a lot of moving parts in your data center. Here are the three problems that come out of that, right? The overall problem is you just can't manage it manually. You want to automate this, right? And you want to automate it with DSIM. And so the question is, if you tell that to somebody, they understand exactly, and they say, I don't care about that problem, that's a moment of truth. And so we'll get to that in a second. But you fundamentally want to convey the problem. And this is where Nlyte would come in, right? And this is where we'd say, we help automate all of these processes, right? We help automate the management of all your data center infrastructure. And here's just a partial list of some of the companies who use Nlyte, right? So the question is that I would have to any executives is, if you're doing it manually and these companies are automating it, what do you know that they don't? And the answer is, you're just not as efficient as these companies, right? These companies have lower costs, they have more efficient people, and they're able to be more agile and responsive to the business. So if we back up and you go in, and as I said, you find an executive, you have a company, they've got, 1,000 racks or more, or 500 racks or more. There are really two types of data center executives. There are those who are unaware that they have a problem, and there are those that are aware of the problem. Well, technically, there are those that could already be using Nlyte, but let's leave that outside of this. But there are two types of sort of executives: those who don't know they have a problem, and those that are aware of the problem. But if you back up a little bit, what you will find is those are two different stages in the sales cycle, right? So if an individual is unaware of the problem, I call that the evangelical sale, right? They don't know they have the problem. It's up to us to educate them. It's up to us to go in and say, hey, this is what we found. We have literally hundreds of companies, Fortune 100 leading companies, Fortune 1000, that are using this technology because they think they have these issues, and we think you do too. And so we'll get a little more into this in just a second. Once they are aware of the problem, then it becomes a competitive sale, right? And we go through the process, which we're all very familiar, right? Where there's an evaluation, there's competitive differentiation, there might be a proof of concept, but there's a lot that goes into that evaluation stage. And then there goes the purchase, right? The negotiation, the PO, the purchase, and then there's ultimately the implementation. But as I said at the beginning, really, you have to determine when you walk in, does this company know it has a problem or does it not, right? And, sometimes, forgive me, but often I find that sometimes salespeople go in and they just start whipping the stories out, the functionality out, but they haven't determined, does this company really know they have the issue that we solve, or do they not? So it's a good thing to understand when you walk in, do they know they have a problem or do they not? And if they do know, that's a different thing than if it's an evangelical sale. So why is the problem so critical to find? And I just will keep coming back to the problem, right? So it really starts and guides the customer journey, right? You want to start right there because that's really why the customer is going to go with you through this process and have a relationship with you, right? It is to solve a problem. I often say you can walk into an account and have great ROI, but if you're not solving a problem that's front of mind, they'll get to that project eventually, because there are a lot of products that provide ROI, and ROI is important. But if you're not solving a problem for the person you're selling to, it's going to be much more challenging, right? As I was relating here, people solve problems, right? ROI will provide justification. Does ROI matter if the prospect doesn't care? And I'll get to a story in just a second with Starbucks that I had in my own personal life. But in the end, people solve problems. The ROI just becomes a justification for why they're going to do a project. Here's a fun one. People care about themselves. Hey, we all have learned this, right? People want to talk about themselves. They don't care about Nlyte. They don't care about your company. They care about themselves, and the problem is about them. It's about their life, so they want to talk about themselves, as most people do, and anyone that's ever dated before understands this. If the prospect understands but does not feel they have the problem, you're just kind of a hard sales process, right? In fact, you may even want to walk away, right? If they understand exactly what a DSIM can do for them, and they look at it, and they look at their data center, and they say, I don't really care. That is going to be a hard sales cycle. Maybe you want to continue on, but I think you want to really evaluate if that's the right prospect for you and if that's where you want to be spending time. And then another thing, the problem, as we mentioned at the start, right, it starts and guides the customer journey, but it's also what you reference back throughout the sales cycle, right? At the beginning, you say, here's the problem we solved. Here's why our solution is best as you get into evaluating different products and why you're explaining why Nlyte is the best product. It's what you reference back to and say, we solved that problem better than anyone, and here's why. And I'm going to come to slides where we talk about how we differentiate Nlyte, and we'll get into that in just a second. And then lastly, here's the expected ROI you're going to get by solving that problem. So again, that problem is the great sort of touchstone that you go throughout the sales cycle and keep referencing back, right? And another beautiful thing about a problem, it allows you to be the expert, right? To give guidance. And that's really what we turn to organizations for. I expect any company selling me technology to know the problem better than me and how it gets solved, because that's what they deal with every day. And I want them to come in and explain how they're going to solve that problem and how others have had that problem solved by Nlyte. So again, the problem is so critical to define. And as I mentioned before, here's what I call my cautionary tale, and it was when I was with a previous technology company. We went and we were selling into Starbucks, and they were growing leaps and bounds at this time, right? This was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And we went, we had the right guy, he was the VP of operations, he liked us, he thought we had the best solution. We did an exhaustive ROI analysis and said we could reduce his purchasing costs by 15%. And then in the end, he agreed with all of us, liked us, loved the solution, said, you're going to save me 15%. I actually believe that. But he said, all I care about right now, the only thing I've been told that is I should focus on is opening new stores. So if you don't solve that problem for me, I'll get to this later. And we all know in software, getting to something later means they're never going to get to it, right? And so this is my cautionary tale. You can go in and talk about ROI, but if people are not bought into the problem, this was a 6-month sales cycle with literally half a dozen to a dozen people at any given time working on the project. That's a lot of money spent. That's a lot of opportunity costs. That's just a lot of straight up costs when we hadn't properly defined the problem right up, that this man had the problem that we solved. So the problem is consistent, but the issue will vary, and this is what is challenging in any given sales cycle, right? The problem is the complexity of the data center and trying to manage that and automate the processes so that a company is consistent, they're optimizing their resources, they're optimizing their people, and they're getting more agile. The problem is consistent, but the issue is going to vary from organization to organization. It might be capacity planning. How can you do capacity planning if you don't know where your assets are, what resources they're using? If you're doing migrations and consolidations, how are you going to effectively plan that out, execute it, do the workflow around all the different stages of a migration or a consolidation if you don't have some sort of solution to automate it? Asset lifecycle management might be a core issue for some organization of managing those assets and properly determining who owns those assets, where those assets are located. Some companies buy Nlyte because they have an audit and compliance issue. I told you about the Australian financial company that had an issue with they didn't know where their assets were. Sometimes it boils down to that, is just knowing where your resources are. We've had companies in Europe buy us for ISO 27001 because there's an element in there that says you need to know where your physical assets are. So sometimes the problem shows itself as an issue in audit and compliance. Operational efficiency. A lot of times companies, how do we get more energy out? Are we running out of energy? Or they have green initiatives around operational efficiency. Sometimes that's the core, the touchstone, the issue for a given company, and that's what really resonates with them. And lastly, tech refresh is probably one of the most powerful stories, but it's a little esoteric, and the people who get it completely, that the paradox, the Jevon paradox, that if you're not doing tech refresh, if you're not buying new assets, you're not keeping up with Moore's Law, you're actually spending more money than you should be, because if you were, excuse me, if you were keeping up with the tech refresh process, you'd actually be lowering your costs. And we actually have a webinar just on tech refresh. So if you go look on the Nlyte website, we do have a webinar just on the tech refresh process, because I think a lot of organizations think, oh, we don't want to be buying these assets, that's how we save money, and it's the exact opposite. If you're keeping up with Moore's Law, you're actually spending less on resources, you're getting more computing power, you're spending less on energy in the long run. And so, again, I frame it as the problem is the complexity of the data center, right? And you're wasting money on resources, people aren't as efficient as they could be, and you're not as agile to the needs of the business, right? That's the real problem. But the issue is going to expose itself in varying different ways in varying different organizations. So that's sort of the why DSIM, right? And then you get into, okay, why Nlyte? Why Nlyte, right? Well, when you get down to it, I like to keep things in threes. I think many people know the power of three, right? Three key messages, right? We have the most mature and robust solution. We have a modern, flexible, web services-based architecture. And lastly, we are the leader, market leader in DSIM, right? And by providing a robust solution, and I'll talk about each of these in just a second, right, you maximize the use and the coverage of your DSIM investment. So let's get into it, right? We have the most mature solution, right? We have the most comprehensive solution that's across asset management, capacity planning, workflow, analytics, monitoring, alarming. We fit into an organization and cover as many processes as possible. We also scale effectively at any size. We are actually just announced today our hyperscale edition of Nlyte. So now we have 3 editions. We have on-demand, we have our enterprise, and we have hyperscale. And hyperscale is for large organizations going over 20, 30,000 racks up to, we certify up to 150,000 racks. So this is for large organizations, this is for government agencies, right? And we can scale across any size from 50 racks up to, as I said, 150,000 racks, right? And that scaling is not only when it's running, because you want rapid responses, but if you're doing reporting, if you're monitoring energy, if you're loading data, all of it scales effectively, right? We have the most robust workflow in the market. We have patented resource optimization capabilities. We have extremely robust analytics capabilities and reporting capabilities. We provide a lot of those reports out of the box, but you can create your own custom reports and dashboards. And we have this extensive ecosystem of pre-built infrastructure integrations, whether it's in environmental information, RFID information, asset information, or into ITSM systems, right? So we have the most robust solution, but a key thing, and again, it gets a little esoteric, we have the best architecture, right? And why does that matter? The total cost of ownership and the ability and flexibility of that architecture is going to be key to any organization. And any organization worth its weight is going to have an architect who's going to want to evaluate the architecture of a DSIM solution, right? We have a modern web-based architecture. There's no client-server element in our solution. Some of our competitors use client-server. So as a modern web-based architecture, we have a central repository, right? It's a 100% software solution. We have no hardware. We don't have a client, which means you got to manage client software, or it poses a security issue because some client has a bunch of your data and it walks out the door and it gets compromised. We don't have that. It's a completely web-based solution. There's no hardware. There's no data going out onto the clients. We have some companies with 45 data centers worldwide operating into a single repository. We have this very lean, intelligent design that stores data in such a way that we can scale and support companies up to today. We support companies at 30,000 racks, 35,000 racks. We're continuing to grow. Another important part of our architecture, built-in web services communication framework, because DSIM is not an island. You're going to want to put it in. You're going to want to manage the assets and see the floor and see all the connections. But then you're going to want to tie it into RFID, or tie it into power sources, or tie it into a change management system, or tie it into some other type of financial system or ERP system. That's where the strength of the architecture comes in, is we have a built-in communications framework that allows you to easily integrate with all these different systems. We provide pre-built ITSM connectors for many of the popular brands, such as Remedy or Atrium, or like I said, some of the CMDBs out there. So again, that communications framework is critical our architecture and critical to the cost of implementing DSIM. Because in the long run, if you're integrating into these systems, yeah, a lot of other companies will say, yeah, we can go build that for you, but it's going to be costly to maintain those connections. We've built ours with that in mind, so it's very easy, and we continuously maintain those connections. And we offer both a premise and on-demand solution for some companies who might want some data centers on-premise, and maybe they want some of their data centers on demand, and eventually they'll bring them on-premise. So a lot of flexibility by offering both premise and on-demand. And lastly, we are the market leader, and that sounds a little bit hokey, but in September, Gartner came out and said there were 4 companies that were leaders in the DSIM market, right, according to the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And we are the only non-billion-dollar company. One day we'll get there, but this is all we do. We are the only company of those 4 that's all we do. It's what we focus on. We were the first company with a modern DSIM solution. It is all we do. We've been doing this for over a decade. We're on the 7th generation of our technology. Gartner recognized us in the leader position. I'm going to show you a couple graphics here which show that our product, after they ranked the company in September, they came out with a report in December which ranked our product in the enterprise and mid-market as having the best product, the highest ranked product, and I'll show those graphics in just a second, right? We have the largest and the most sophisticated data center deployments in the world. We have a customer-driven roadmap where we're constantly raising the bar based on the feedback we hear from the customers, and we are fanatical about customer satisfaction. We have a 98% customer retention rate. That just shows customers use us and stay with us. And so here's the graphic I wanted to just show. It's one of my last slides. And at this point, as you can, I think I'm getting some feedback. Justine, can you mute? Because I think we're actually hearing you. Thank you. So I think this is one of my last slides. As I mentioned before, in September, Gartner came out with the Magic Quadrant. And what they'll tell you is the Magic Quadrant evaluates 2 things, right? The axes are vision of the company and ability to execute. But it's really about the company. When they do a critical capabilities report, it's about doing a deep dive on the product. And so in the fall of 2014, they did a deep dive of the Nlyte product. And as you can see, for large enterprise managed service providers and mid-size enterprises, we have the highest ranking product of those 7 products which were ranked by Gartner. So really, 2015 is the year for DSIM, right? I think companies are starting to say, hey, we've made these large investments in data centers. We want to make sure we have our arms around it and that this market is expanding because people realize they're managing literally $10, $100 million assets with spreadsheets, and they're just starting to recognize the issues of that, right? So DSIM solved the problem of complexity, of automating your processes around managing data center infrastructure, right? And I think it's important for anyone who's going out, you being our partners, understand when you walk in, does this company understand the problem they have? Is it an evangelical sale, or is it a competitive sale, right? It will eventually, when you go from evangelical, it'd be great if it doesn't turn competitive, but often they want to bring in other companies because nobody wants to go with just one particular vendor. But it's good to understand when you walk in that differentiation. Do they know they have the problem, or do they not know? And that'll help you form the conversation and help you guide them appropriately and as they go through this DSIM evaluation, right? And so you need to find the problem, right? Every data center has the problem. As I said, the problem's always the same. It's how does the issue get exposed? And so I think you have to dig in and understand that. And that's the key to successfully selling Nlyte, right, is getting people to understand the problem they have specific to their data centers and how you can help solve it. So lastly, we just recently put this out. It's a new content to help educate prospects. If you have folks that want to understand more about DSIM, Dummies books seem to be very appealing to folks. They feel they're very approachable. We've already had 1,000 people download this particular DSIM for Dummies booklet, which just became available last month. So you can go to the Nlyte homepage, and right on the bar you can see the second option is DSIM for Dummies, and you can download it, or you can have any prospects or any folks you're talking to want to educate themselves on DSIM. It was actually written by an outside organization called Wiley, but it's a great primer for folks who want to learn about DSIM. And so I think, have I run over time? Yeah, I'm over time. So any questions that came in, I will get to after, or Justine will get back to you folks with any questions you might have given us. So I want to thank everybody for the time you spent with us. We appreciate you listening. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me at mark.gatos@nlyte.com or contact Justine. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Justine.